thinking about Metropolis and starting to wonder about deconstructing this text in terms of reference of the comparative study of text is difficult, because there's so much going on in each frame of this text. Its expressionistic style lends you all sorts of insights into the symbolism, the concepts, the ideas, the shapes, the mise-en-scène, the filmic techniques, that you can get lost in that area when it comes to doing this essay and forget that you're also dealing with quite a major text in 1984. So it's a good idea to sort of let parts tell the whole when trying to interpret the text in many ways. However, it's important to keep in mind that you are dealing with an entire concept in your exam and in your essay. This is an example, though, of a way into some of the thematic concerns of the text. Here we have some stills that I'm going to use. I won't use the actual film because there are some copyright issues, but these are stills, of course, from Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And here we have the allegorical fable that Maria is telling the gathered workers underground in their underground chapel. And she's giving them the story of the Tower of Babel. So we're already dealing with intertextuality in terms of a biblical allusion. And that's already been foreshadowed, because, as we are no doubt aware, there is, of course, a building in Metropolis where Friedemann lives called the New Tower of Babel. So the symbolism is laid on. It's really straightforward. But remember, of course, in 1926, the symbolism in terms of this expressionistic filmmaking was something that had to be laid on, because the film language is still really in its early phases, in its early days here. So we start to sort of even deconstruct what's going on with this particular scene in terms of mise-en-scène and in terms of shape and in terms of character and ideas. Let's have a think about how this is even introduced by Lang and what the expressionistic moments represent. So when deconstructing any scene, obviously you're looking for what you would consider to be the key image, the salient image, the one that draws your attention immediately. And of course, the obvious sort of rule of thumb there is that we have our Tower of Babel model, at least, our architectural model of the Tower of Babel, done in that traditional classical form of how it was described in that biblical sense, in the way the story is told, with our ramp moving up this outside of the building and growing ever taller and ever larger. The second thing we have is this gentleman here, one of the architects, who is sitting very much like Rodin's Thinker. Now, that particular famous sculpture was originally meant to be part of a larger sculpture that represented the gates to hell from the Dante story of the Divine Comedy. And we know, of course, that Frieda's descent into the underworld of Metropolis very much reflects that sensibility as well of both Renaissance thinking or late medieval, early Renaissance thinking of biblical stories and biblical stories themselves. This gentleman over here, who probably is setting himself apart and is likely the chief architect, the way he's sitting by himself in this sort of authoritarian area. He's the guy who seems to be, when we see him later in at least in the story, in charge of the whole concept. He's the one man whose concept was build this tower. So that guy there is our leader, and he's set apart also in terms of costume. So his costume is also representative of something that is different to what all the other gentlemen are wearing, and his men are considering his idea, his concept, his thing, and it's sort of like they're on an epoch of a new stage in our evolution. And as we know in the story of the Tower of Babel, this is something that fails magnificently later on. Now, just as a chief reminder as to what's going on in terms of the realistic world, or at least the expressionistic world of Metropolis, that is, the world that is compared to that of the allegorical when the stories are told, the new Tower of Babel sits differently in its design and look to the biblical one, but it also is placed, as we can tell here, it also lives in that salient position on the screen. So that is a clever design in terms of what's going on with what Lang was trying to achieve in a filmic sense. And of course the ability of that building to dwarf everything else, even the other reasonably tall and menacing buildings that we see in terms of perspective, how large they are, when we can see the roads and we can see the people all the way down here. They're elongated, they're larger than what would have been realistic in 1926. So the Tower of Babel the new Tower of Babel is an absurdly large, grandiose building. We could talk about its claws, we could talk about its imagery there, but that is an extended part of what's going on. We don't need to go into that detail at this juncture. As the story progresses, we start to see the building come into fruition, and we get to see what has to happen. And an enormous number of workers are required. An enormous amount of labour is required to actually bring this thing into being. And so this imagery here of these people coming to work on the Tower of Babel has a few things going on. Firstly, of course, we have already seen an image like this in Metropolis. We've already come across such an image in Metropolis, and we've already made a consideration as to what that image looks like. And there it is there. So we're getting a reflection in our allegorical fable, in our religious sort of terminology, and it's also something that's being played out for real in the world of Metropolis, at least. The image of the workers in the shift change sequence, of which many people, of course, write about in their essay. But as we bring in this particular one this actual allegorical one, we see, of course, how particularly the men have a similar shape and design. Look at this man here. He is very much, and would belong very much, in the shift change in many, many ways. So there is that repetition of image that you need to talk about. The other thing that's interesting is the fact that we have this here. That's, to me, the fascinating thing. These people are coming from all the different lands. That's why they are coming in those particular shapes and in that particular way. So they're coming from all different groups, all different tribes, all different whatever you want to call it, the 4 or 5 corners of the world and so forth. So they are arriving to build this Tower of Babel. This is a complete human endeavour. All human beings are involved in it. We know that Metropolis doesn't really offer us an image of anywhere outside of Metropolis. The entire universe is the world of that city. And in 1984, of course, Oceania and indeed Airstrip 1 exist entirely in the novel. Whilst there is a mention of other places, East Asia and Eurasia, the only way we can actually trust that that is real is the fact that Winston believes it to be the case because he's been told. He doesn't seem to question the fact that those other countries exist, even though he questions who's fighting who. It's an interesting thing that he leaves out. But here, this is sort of like all of humanity is what is being represented by this particular image. And also it's reflecting what we've seen before in terms of shift change and the look. So Lang's saying quite clearly that the world of Metropolis is just another version of this story. And so the inevitable conclusion, even the biblical style flood that destroys the city, the apocalyptic moments at the end are foreshadowed through these particular allegorical moments. Then we get, of course, the moment of revolution where the workers must overwhelm the capitalist, the builder. So we have our capitalist, who is very much an allegorical representation of Friedrichsen. There he is there, once again in that salient position on the screen, once again centralised and placed in the same place where his tower was and our real tower is, looking towards us. Now the interesting thing is, the workers down here, they are there, very angry they are. These guys, and there's one down here as well, these guys are facing our architect from the same point of view that we're facing him. They're holding the same angle that the camera is. One might suggest that Lang is saying that the camera is one of these other workers who are aggressively against this architect. He is positioning the audience in terms of the worker over the capitalist, the worker, the slave over the slave driver, and so forth. So we're in the position now, like Frida, of moving into the world of the workers and moving against the world of power. There is a change in the dynamic there, and there is a shift in the way of thinking for Frida and possibly for those of us. So we're being told very clearly who the enemies are in this particular story by this allegorical style and by this setup, by this imagery, and by the way in which these actors have been placed in the shot. Okay, so that's a kind of mise-en-scène thing you need to think about, the placement in the scene. And here we have the placement of the men in the scene against the architect of the Tower of Babel. It's a very well done thing. And of course what we have missing, which is somewhere about here, is our mediator. This is where the hole is in the story that Maria will tell us is the thing that we need to have in order for this type of revolution, this type of destruction not to occur. And that is exceptionally important in understanding the broader reference of what's going on in Metropolis. The interesting thing is, once we see Metropolis and then we read 1984, we might actually misconstrue the idea that someone like Winston is indeed our mediator, which he isn't, as we find out. So there's a good, nice little comparison in terms of the way the stories are told. So the revolution begins, and apologies, this picture isn't terribly large, but it doesn't have that scope that you're meant to have when you're talking about something like Metropolis. But now we have the workers overwhelming our architect in that style, which we will see. It's a foreshadowing, of course, of what will occur when the city is destroyed. So at this moment we get this incredible revolution, and then we get a reasonably intriguing shot. We get this very quick shot of all these hands rising up into the air like that around the Tower of Babel, and these concentric circles here around the top of the tower. This sort of stuff here, these circles, and then these hands. Then of course we still have this, which is the edge of the fable. It's kind of like a filmic technique that many of us know and are familiar with, which is we are not talking about reality now, so let's actually manipulate the way the screen looks. That kind of thing is going on as well. But this shot is an intriguing one, and what these hands represent have that expressionistic idea, that concept of revolution, that concept of the worker overwhelming a tower, and the tower has lost its salience because the arms and hands are now the same size. We're talking about perspective here, not in terms of waking up to something, but perspective in shot. Something close to a shot appears and looms larger than something further away. And so now the workers are framed in a bigger sense, even one part of their body. They are stronger, bigger, and more powerful than the tower itself. So in the end, when thinking about a movie like Metropolis or a film like Metropolis, make sure that you are thinking in terms of some of the way those scenes work as complete works, as complete pieces. And now thinking about how does it contrast with something like 1984. Well, here we have, of course, the idea of hierarchy and power, one of the themes that works across both texts in a very, very important way. Think of the way in which Orwell places Goldstein's manifesto in the centre of the narrative, and the way Lang places these biblical sort of Maria stories in his documents. So both of these have this allegorical background driving what is going on in the main plot and influencing the reader, the viewer, or what have you, in terms of where to position themselves and how they position themselves, and also representing their own contexts. So that kind of thing is something you need to talk about in your response and in your essay. Excellent.